Hey there, sleepyheads. Welcome back to the channel. Before we drift into tonight's tale of Evergreen and the origin of the crown, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from tonight and what time it is for you right now. Drop it in the comments below. It's always magical seeing how far and wide this sleepy little community reaches. All right, lights low, blankets up. Let's begin. Long before the land of Ooo, before the Candy Kingdom, before the rise and fall of wizards, there was an age so ancient it feels almost like a dream. This was a time when the world breathed in a different rhythm. The seas were wilder, the skies heavier, and magic didn't drift in scattered pockets. The way it does now, it flowed like a living river, deep and strong, shaping everything it touched. The forces of nature weren't merely weather patterns or shifting tides. They had voices, faces, and wills of their own. In this age, the balance of the world was guarded by four great beings, each tied to a fundamental element: fire, slime, candy, and ice. These weren't kingdoms yet. They were primordial forces embodied in living beings. The fire elemental burned with the fierce, unstoppable energy of the sun. The slime elemental was endless adaptability, shifting and reforming in ways no obstacle could halt. The candy elemental was warmth, nurturing, and sweetness, life's gentler thread. And then there was the ice elemental, urgence, evergreen. The embodiment of winter's power was unlike the others. Where fire blazed unpredictably and slime shifted constantly, Evergreen stood firm, unmoving, as if time itself could not erode him. His skin was pale like carved glacier stone, and his eyes shone with the deep cold of the farthest polar night. He was not simply a master of ice and snow. He was ice and snow, the will of frost given a mind and a voice, detached patience only an immortal could have. The seasons turned below him, but in his halls, winter reigned eternal. The world in those days was not peaceful. Great beasts roamed the earth, some born of magic, others shaped by the raw chaos left over from creation itself. Rivers could shift their paths overnight. Mountains could rise in a single storm, and the stars were not as distant as they are now. They seemed to watch, sometimes moving in ways no mortal could explain. Among the greatest of these celestial wanderers was something even Evergreen feared: the comet. This comet was no ordinary traveler of the skies. It was said to appear once in an age, always bringing change, sometimes subtle, sometimes catastrophic. The comet was a vessel of unimaginable power, and the legends whispered that it carried the will of something beyond mortal understanding. In some ages it brought prosperity, in others ruin, and as the time of our tale begins, that comet was drawing closer. Even from his frozen halls, Evergreen could feel it. A tension in the magic around him, a subtle pull, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He had studied the comet before in ancient texts, carved into the ice walls of his fortress. Every record spoke of transformation, of the world reshaping after its passing. But this time, Evergreen sensed something different, something dangerous. The fire elemental called for a council, urging the four to meet and prepare. But Evergreen was slow to answer. In his mind, such meetings were often filled with talk and little action. He believed the others could not truly comprehend the scale of what was coming. Only he had the will to act decisively. Only he could craft the solution. Outside, winter's storms began to grow harsher, even in lands that had never known snow. Evergreen walked the length of his fortress's highest balcony, staring at the growing point of light in the sky. Day by day, it grew brighter. Soon it would be large enough to see even in daylight. To the common folk, it might have seemed beautiful, even wondrous. But to Evergreen, it was the herald of a test he alone was worthy to face. He began to gather resources, rare crystals from the deepest caverns, enchanted metals cooled in glacial waters, fragments of meteorite from ages past. His mind worked endlessly, sketching arcane designs, runes, and sigils in sheets of frost that shimmered in the torchlight. He wasn't simply preparing for the comet's arrival, he was preparing to master it. And in the shadows of his great halls, a quiet figure watched, small, loyal, and eager to please. This was Gunther, the apprentice who would one day shape the fate of the crown in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Gunther was not like the grand wizards or elemental beings Evergreen occasionally tolerated in his presence. He was small, waddling, with a voice that came out in soft, squeaky tones. To most, he might have seemed unremarkable, but to Evergreen, Gunther was useful. The little apprentice could carry tools, fetch ingredients, and hold candles steady in the biting winds of the fortress's higher towers. Evergreen did not indulge in sentiment. He never told Gunther he valued him, nor did he offer praise for a job well done. But in his own way, he relied on the penguin-like apprentice more than he admitted even to himself. Gunther was always there, padding quietly behind him, braving the cold without complaint, eyes wide with a mix of awe and determination. The comet's light continued to grow stronger, casting a pale green glow across the snowfields. Evergreen's preparations became feverish. The grand halls that once echoed with the sound of his measured footsteps now rang with the metallic scrape of tools, the hum of magical wards, and the occasional sharp command barked at Gunther. Shelves of ancient tomes lay open, their pages covered in glimmering frost as Evergreen traced runes with a gloved finger, murmuring to himself in an old tongue few alive could still understand. To the other elementals, his absence was troubling. The candy elemental sent gentle messages urging cooperation. The slime elemental, in a rare moment of concern, offered to send their people to help. Even the fire elemental, despite their rivalry, extended a warning. The comet was unpredictable, and it would take more than one being's power to shape its course. Evergreen ignored them all. In his mind, asking for help was not a sign of strength, it was a sign of weakness. And weakness, in a moment like this, was unacceptable. His plan was bold. He would forge an artifact so powerful that no force, comet, or otherwise could resist it. A crown set with jewels cut from the heart of enchanted glaciers, laced with runes older than the world itself. This crown would channel his power and amplify it beyond the limits of even an elemental. Through it, he would not simply repel the comet, he would command it, bending its will to his own. Gunther assisted without truly understanding the scale of what they were making. The little apprentice fetched stones from vaults so cold they burned to touch, polished metal that shimmered with inner light, and held vials of liquid starlight, precious and volatile, while Evergreen worked. Each step of the forging was meticulous, steeped in ritual. The crown was not simply being built, It was being woven into the very weave of the world's magic. Nights in the fortress grew longer, though whether it was the season or the comet's influence was impossible to say. Outside, the storms grew harsher still. Icicles hung from the balconies like glass spears, and the sound of the wind became a constant low moan through the halls. Yet within the workshop there was a sense of purpose so intense it seemed to make the air hum. Sometimes Gunther would glance up at Evergreen's face and catch something unusual aflicker in those cold blue eyes. Determination, yes, but also something sharper. Possession. It was as though Evergreen had begun to see the crown not just as a tool, but as an extension of himself, a part of his identity even before it was complete. Evergreen, of course, would never admit such a thing. In his mind, this was about the comet and the world's safety. But deep down, in some frozen chamber of his heart, he relished the thought that his crown would be the one to decide the fate of the age. The other elementals had not stopped their warnings. They sent messengers, brave ones, skilled in magic, up the treacherous mountain paths to plead with Evergreen. Most were turned away before they could reach him. Those who did were met with polite but icy dismissal. Evergreen spoke in measured tones, but his words were final. The matter was in hand, and he had no need for interference. Gunther saw the pattern, but didn't question it. To him, Evergreen's confidence was a comfort. If his masters said the world would be saved, then it would be saved. Still, a part of the Gunther couldn't help but wonder why the crown was starting to feel more important than the comet itself. As the nights passed, the green glow of the comet began to stain even the brightest snowfields. It hung in the sky like a watchful eye, and those who saw it from far-off lands whispered of omens and endings. Evergreen paid no mind to such talk. To him, omens were for those without the power to change them. One evening, as the crown neared completion, Evergreen stood before the balcony once again, the comet looming larger than ever. The glow painted his face an eerie mix of frost blue and comet green. Gunther stood beside him, shivering slightly, not from the cold, but from something he couldn't name. Evergreen's voice broke the silence, calm but heavy with meaning. It will be mine to command. The comet will not strike. The world will bend to the will of ice. And in that moment, the first threads of the curse began to weave themselves into the crown, not from any ancient doom or celestial fate, but from the pride of the one who forged it. The forging entered its final phase. Evergreen had locked himself and Gunther in the highest workshop of the fortress, a chamber where the walls were carved entirely from translucent ice. The light of the comet filtered through them in shifting, ghostly patterns, turning the room into a living kaleidoscope of green and blue. Every flicker of color seemed to sink into the crown as it took shape, as though the comet itself was already answering Evergreen's call. The frame of the crown was made from an alloy no mortal blacksmith could craft, a blend of metals cooled in the breath of ice spirits and hammered beneath the light of a lunar eclipse. Each blow of Evergreen's hammer echoed like a crack through a frozen lake. Gunther worked tirelessly, holding tools, stirring cauldrons of molten enchantment, and fetching ingredients that defied ordinary description: powdered frost flower petals, shards of frozen lightning, and drops of water collected from the melting heart of an ancient iceberg. Evergreen spoke less now. His focus was absolute. His eyes locked on the crown as though it were the only thing in existence. When he did speak, it was to recite old incantations, the words curling through the air like tendrils of frost. Gunther repeated some of them quietly, not truly understanding their meaning, but hoping to help. Evergreen never corrected him. Perhaps he didn't even hear him anymore. The other elementals had grown silent in their attempts to reach him. The fire elemental's last message had been sharp and warning, the candy elemental's last plea tinged with sadness. The slime elemental had sent no words, only a small gift of protective charms that Evergreen left untouched on a table in the corner. Whether he ignored them out of pride or because he truly believed he needed nothing else, even Gunther couldn't tell. Days blurred into nights and nights into days. The crown was now complete in form, but the most dangerous step remained binding it to Evergreen's essence. This was the heart of his plan. He believed that by anchoring the crown's magic directly to himself, he could ensure that no one else could wield it. To him, this was a precaution. To the forces that govern magic, it was something far more dangerous. Evergreen prepared for the ritual with meticulous care. He laid out a circle of ancient runes carved into the ice floor, each glowing faintly in the comet's light. At the center sat the crown, resting on a pedestal of frozen crystal. Around them, the air was so cold it seemed to bite at the lungs, yet the heat of magic made the skin prickle. Gunther stood at the edge of the circle, clutching a small, rune-etched rod Evergreen had given him. His task was simple. Hold it steady, and follow Evergreen's instructions without hesitation. He didn't know what the rod was for, only that it hummed faintly in his flippers, as though alive. Evergreen stepped into the circle, his tall figure outlined by the glow of the runes. He raised his hands, and the room seemed to still. The wind outside stopped howling. The flicker of the torches froze in mid-dance. For a moment, it was as if time itself had paused to watch. He began the chant, his voice deep and resonant, carrying the authority of someone who had lived far longer than the rise and fall of nations. The crown trembled on its pedestal, the jewels pulsing with light. A thin mist swirled upward, wrapping around Evergreen like a living thing. The magic was thick enough to taste, cold and sharp like breathing in a blizzard. The comet's light flared brighter as though answering him. The glow seeped into the runes, filling them with a strange, almost living awareness. Evergreen's voice grew louder, and the crown rose slowly into the air, spinning in place. But in that rising power, there was something else, something not part of Evergreen's plan. Magic has a will of its own, and when it is bound to a living being, it doesn't simply obey. It learns. It adapts. And in binding the crown to himself so fully, Evergreen wasn't just giving it power, he was giving it his thoughts, his flaws, his pride. Gunther watched as his master's expression shifted. For the first time since the forging began, Evergreen smiled, not the faint, cold curve of lips he sometimes gave when amused, but a broad, sharp smile filled with the thrill of control. The crown's jewels flashed in perfect unison with his eyes, and in that reflection, the beginnings of a curse took root. The ritual reached its peak, and with a final word of command, the crown shot back down onto its pedestal, landing with a ringing note that seemed to echo through the whole fortress. The runes dimmed, the wind returned, and time resumed its flow. Evergreen stepped out of the circle, the crown in his hands. He turned it slowly, the jewels glittering in the comet's light. Gunther approached carefully, his small eyes fixed on it in awe. It was beautiful, yes, but there was something unsettling about it now. The air around it felt heavier, and the longer Gunther looked, the more he felt as though the crown was looking back. Evergreen didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he simply didn't care. "It is ready," he said, his voice low but certain. "The comet will not take this world. I will see to that." Far above them, in the endless sky, the comet continued its slow, unstoppable approach. The world outside whispered in fear, but within the icy walls of Evergreen's fortress, there was no fear, only the steady heartbeat of ambition. wrapped in frost and crowned with power. In the days that followed, Evergreen kept the crown closer than anything else he had ever owned. It rested on a stand beside his throne in the fortress's great hall, its jewels glinting faintly even when no light touched them. At times, Gunther would catch his master speaking to it in low tones, as if explaining plans to a trusted ally. Evergreen had always been a solitary figure, but now it seemed as though the crown had taken the place of any need for company. The comet grew larger still, dominating the sky. Its green light washed over the mountains, painting even the darkest ice cliffs in strange, shifting hues. Storms raged endlessly, as though the world itself was reacting to the celestial approach. And while the other elementals sent warnings and pleas for unity, Evergreen answered none of them. Gunther could feel the tension in the air, not the kind of tension before a simple winter storm, but the kind that comes before the breaking of an age. The fortress itself seemed to sense it. Ice creaked deep in the walls at night, and faint, unfamiliar whispers sometimes echoed down the empty corridors. One evening, Evergreen summoned Gunther to the high balcony once again. The wind tore at their cloaks, and the comet loomed so close it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Evergreen stood tall against the gale, the crown in his hands. "It will be soon," he said, his voice steady. "When it comes, I will rise to meet it. The others will see, all will see. Ice is the will that endures." Gunther nodded, though he wasn't sure if Evergreen was speaking to him or to the crown. He noticed the way Evergreen's fingers lingered along the metal, almost as though the crown were alive beneath his touch. As the days passed, Evergreen began to test the crown's abilities. In the frozen courtyards, he would summon storms so vast they blotted out the horizon, shape glaciers with a flick of his hand, and freeze entire lakes in seconds. Gunther followed him faithfully, watching as his master's power grew to staggering heights. Yet each time Evergreen used the crown, his expression changed. There was always that same glint in his eyes, that subtle tightening at the corners of his mouth. The crown was no longer just a tool. It was becoming part of him, and he part of it. The other elementals, realizing that Evergreen would not join them, began their own preparations. But without the power of the ice elemental at their side, their efforts felt incomplete. They could not stop him, and they could not stop the comet alone. Whispers spread through the ancient world. If Evergreen failed, all might be lost. On the eve of the comet's arrival, the fortress was silent save for the howl of the wind outside. Evergreen worked through the night, finalizing his plan, the crown never leaving his side. Gunther slept lightly near the workshop door, the cold seeping even to his dreams. When dawn came, the comet was massive in the sky, its tail streaking green fire across the heavens. The air was charged thick with magic. Evergreen donned his battle robes, deep blue and silver, embroidered with runes that shimmered faintly in the light. He placed the crown upon his head for the first time. The change was immediate. The jewels flared to life, and the air around him crystallized in delicate patterns of frost. Gunther gasped softly. The Evergreen before him was still his master, but there was something more now. His presence filled the room, his power rolling off him like a blizzard. Evergreen did not speak at first. He simply stood there, breathing slowly, as if savoring the sensation. Then, in a voice that was both his own and somehow greater, he said, "It answers me." That morning he walked the long halls to the fortress gates. Outside, the storm parted for him, the wind falling silent in his presence. The world seemed to bow to his will. Gunther trailed behind, small footprints marking the snow in the wake of Evergreen's stride. They reached the highest peak near the fortress, a place where the sky felt almost within reach. From there, Evergreen could see the comet in its full, terrible beauty, an emerald sphere burning brighter than the sun, tearing through the heavens toward the earth. Evergreen raised his arms, the crown blazing with light. He began to chant in the old language, each word a burst of icy wind. The ground trembled, the sky roared. Shards of frozen air swirled into a colossal vortex above him, a storm meant to match the comet's fury. Gunther stood back, clutching the rune-etched rod, his heart pounding. He didn't know if Evergreen's plan would work, only that his master believed in it completely, and if Evergreen believed, then so did he. But far above, the comet did not slow. Its light grew brighter still, the green fire streaking across the sky in defiance of the storm. And in that moment, as Evergreen's power surged, the first cracks began to form, not in the ice around him, but in the delicate line between his will and the crown's. Somewhere deep within the magic, the crown whispered back. Evergreen had always been a solitary figure, even in an age where magic bound beings together in ways that today would feel impossible. He was not a recluse in the sense of hiding away from the world. He took his place in councils when he deemed them worthy, defended his domain when it was threatened. But the truth was that he found other people distracting, slower, less precise. His mind worked like a finely cut crystal, sharp and cold. Every thought had weight, every plan a calculated purpose. And yet, there was a gap in him that no amount of logic or knowledge could fill. He did not seek companionship, nor did he understand those who craved it. For Evergreen, trust was given only to results, never to words or feelings. The ice elemental's fortress, perched high on the frostbitten peaks, was a perfect mirror of its master. Its halls were wide and gleaming, every wall carved to flawless symmetry. There were no tapestries, no warm hearths, no flickering candles, only the soft luminescence of ice itself casting a pale glow that made the air seem always on the edge of winter dusk. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant groan of glaciers shifting against stone. It was beautiful in a way that demanded respect, but it was not a place built for laughter or warmth. Evergreen did not see this as a flaw. To him, the fortress was efficient. It preserved like ice preserves. It reminded him and anyone who dared to visit that the world's true strength lay not in constant change, but in steadfast endurance. Where fire devoured and slime reshaped, ice endured. That was the truth Evergreen carried like a banner. Still, there were moments, fleeting and unacknowledged, when he would walk the empty corridors and feel the weight of that silence press against him. These moments never lasted long. He would turn his thoughts to his work, to the endless refining of spells and the study of ancient magic. If there was an emptiness there, he buried it in purpose. The other elementals had long ago learned to tread carefully around Evergreen. The candy elemental's soft-spoken diplomacy rarely broke through his icy composure, though they tried more than once to bridge the distance. The slime elemental's unpredictability annoyed him. Their chaotic nature clashed with his need for structure. And the fire elemental, volatile, proud, and quick to anger, was the only one who could truly match his stubbornness, which often led to heated and sometimes literal clashes. In truth, Evergreen's relationship with the others was shaped by a deep and unshakable belief. He was the most capable among them. Not in every way, perhaps, but in the ways that mattered when the fate of the world was at stake. Ice, after all, could outlast fire's destruction, outlast slime's instability, and even temper candy's fragility. This conviction was not born solely from arrogance. It was also the product of his nature. As the ice elemental, He was tied to preservation, to holding fast against the passage of time. His very essence was about resisting change, which made compromise with others, especially those who thrived on change, deeply unnatural to him. And so, when the comet began its long approach, Evergreen's instincts told him to act alone, to prepare in his own way, unburdened by the politics and hesitation of the others. The thought of sitting in endless councils, debating possibilities, while the threat drew closer, was intolerable to him. He needed action, not discussion. The crown became his focus not just as a tool, but as a statement. It was his solution, crafted entirely by his own hand, without the dilution of other minds interfering. If it succeeded, the world would be saved, and everyone would know it was because of him. If it failed well, in Evergreen's mind, failure was not an option worth entertaining. Gunther, ever loyal, followed his master's lead without question. The little apprentice didn't fully grasp the scope of what they were building, but he understood the importance of the work. He could see the way Evergreen's eyes lit, not with warmth, but with the cold fire of purpose whenever he spoke of the crown. Yet even in these early days, before the comet's arrival, subtle signs began to emerge. Evergreen's patience with interruptions grew thinner. He spoke less with those who sought him out. He began to treat the crown not as an object in progress, but as something alive, something he was bringing into being. On nights when the storms outside grew too fierce for work, Evergreen would stand at the highest balcony, staring into the dark. The crown's unfinished frame would rest on a nearby pedestal, and now and then his hand would drift toward it, not to adjust or inspect it, but to simply touch it. His fingers would linger, and in the reflected light of the moon and comet, there was something in his eyes that looked less like vigilance and more like longing. Evergreen's home was not a place of warmth or community, but of crystal walls and echoing silence. His ice palace stood alone atop a frozen plateau, its spires jutting into the sky like jagged shards of a broken mirror. From those towers he could see for miles over endless snowdrifts and frozen lakes that reflected the pale, distant sun. To some, this solitude would have been unbearable, but Evergreen seemed to thrive in it. He had little patience for idle chatter or the politics of other elementals. In fact, the few times he crossed paths with them, his interactions were often clipped and impatient. The fire elementals, for example, found him insufferable, a creature of cold logic and colder demeanor, who treated their passionate flames as if they were childish tantrums. Even the candy elementals of that ancient age, who were known for their boundless cheer, struggled to draw even a ghost of a smile from him. It's not that Evergreen hated others, rather he believed they slowed him down. His mind was constantly turned toward purpose, to mastering the frost, to perfecting his control over the biting wind, and to ensuring that no threat, mortal or magical, could overwhelm his dominion. This fierce independence was partly born of pride. Evergreen saw himself as the purest embodiment of his element, the one true heir of Ice's will. And in a strange way, he wasn't entirely wrong. The frozen world seemed to obey him with a loyalty it showed no other. Blizzards would gather at his command. Glaciers would shift as though bowing to his presence. Yet in gaining this mastery, he also built an invisible wall between himself and the rest of the world. There were stories whispered in the old kingdoms that Evergreen never sought companionship, not even from other elementals. No apprentices, no council members, no one who could share in his endless pursuit of magical perfection. The closest thing to warmth in his life was his own ambition, which burned cold and steady like a star in deep space. But here's the thing, the universe doesn't like unchecked solitude. Sooner or later, fate finds a way to test it. And for Evergreen, that test came in the form of an unexpected partnership, one that would forever alter his path. The apprentice, who would one day be known as Gunther, did not arrive in Evergreen's life through a grand invitation or careful selection. Some say the young penguin had been sent as a diplomatic offering, a token of peace from a southern kingdom that hoped to curry favor with the ice elemental. Others claim Gunther simply wandered into Evergreen's domain, drawn by curiosity and perhaps a strange sense of destiny. At first, Evergreen treated Gunther as he would any lesser creature, with indifference, a slight note of irritation, and an expectation that he would keep out of the way. But Gunther was persistent. He followed Evergreen everywhere, sometimes waddling just far enough behind to avoid being told off, sometimes daring to shuffle right up to the ice elemental's side. Evergreen ignored him at first, then tolerated him, and finally, in his own begrudging way, began to accept his presence. This reluctant companionship didn't thaw Evergreen's heart, not entirely, but it did change his rhythm. Suddenly, the great ice elemental was no longer speaking only to the empty air when he explained his magical work. Sometimes, without realizing it, he would turn to Gunther and mutter a thought aloud. Sometimes, when preparing a complex spell, he would assign the little penguin small tasks, fetching a tool, arranging runes, or carrying fragments of enchanted crystal. In those quiet moments, a fragile, unspoken bond began to form. Evergreen might never have admitted it, but the ice palace no longer felt quite so empty. Evergreen's disdain for others often created rifts, even with those who should have been his allies. The other elementals, fire, candy, slime, and others whose names have been lost to time rarely sought his company, and when they did, the encounters tended to end in mutual irritation. Evergreen had no patience for what he saw as small talk. To him, every conversation needed a purpose. Every interaction had to be moving towards something meaningful, and preferably toward a solution only he could implement. There's a certain loneliness in being that kind of person. The kind who, in their mind, is always just a little bit ahead of everyone else. The ice elemental's gift for magic and his sharp intellect made him a master of his craft, but it also kept him at arm's length from everyone around him. Even the few who tried to understand him found themselves met with cold dismissal if they dared to question his methods. And yet there's an irony here. For all his attempts to keep himself apart, Evergreen was not immune to the quiet need for connection. His brusque orders, his sharp-tongued remarks, his perfectionism, they all hid something human under the surface. The fear that letting people too close would expose his vulnerabilities. He'd sooner be seen as arrogant than fragile. After all, fragility is a dangerous thing to reveal in a world where monsters and rival mages would gladly exploit it. Evergreen's days were filled with a mix of meticulous study and tireless experimentation. His ice palace, though it might not have had the whimsical beauty of Ice King's later creation, was a wonder of magical architecture. The walls shimmered faintly with runes of warding, floors smooth and almost mirror-like, reflecting a pale, ethereal glow. Inside, magical artifacts lined the shelves, preserved relics from before the great cataclysm, frozen samples of plants and creatures long extinct, and scrolls written in a dozen languages, some so old that even Evergreen had to puzzle over their meaning. And at the center of it all was his great ambition, mastery over forces no other mage dared to touch. The crown, at this point in time, was not yet cursed, but Evergreen already regarded it as more than a mere trinket. To him, it was a focus for immense power, a tool that could amplify his abilities beyond mortal limits. And perhaps more importantly, it was something he alone could wield properly. He saw it as his safeguard against the chaos of the world. But if the crown was a safeguard, Evergreen himself was its guardian, and he guarded it fiercely. He didn't trust the other elementals, didn't trust mortal kings, and certainly didn't trust the various magical creatures who roamed the land in those days. In his mind, only he had the knowledge, discipline, and willpower to keep such an artifact from falling into dangerous hands. Of course, that belief that he alone could be trusted was as much a flaw as it was a strength. It blinded him to the possibility that isolation could lead to mistakes. Without peers to challenge his thinking, without anyone to say, "Wait, Evergreen, is this truly the right path?" He walked an increasingly narrow road, one where every decision reinforced his own certainty. Still, there was something admirable in his dedication. Even if his arrogance pushed others away, it also gave him the confidence to act when others hesitated. Evergreen lived in an age when destruction could arrive without warning, and in that kind of world, hesitation could be fatal. It was during this period that Evergreen began to withdraw almost completely from the broader elemental gatherings. While others debated policy or celebrated seasonal changes, he remained in his palace, refining his spells and scanning the skies for signs of trouble. If whispers reached him of some looming threat, a rogue comet, a warlord raising armies, an elemental imbalance, he would quietly take notes, already preparing contingencies while others still argued over whether to act. In that solitude, though, seeds of tragedy were quietly being planted. His fierce independence, his reluctance to collaborate, and his unwavering belief in his own superiority meant that when disaster did approach, he would have only a single companion by his side, and that companion would not be the one Evergreen truly needed. Evergreen's relationships, or rather his lack of them, paint, perhaps, the clearest picture of his inner world. It's not that he was incapable of companionship. In fact, on the rare occasions he spoke with others, his intelligence and force of will could be strangely captivating. But Evergreen carried with him the unshakable belief that no one else could truly understand him. And in a way, he was right. Few had lived through the epochs he had. Fewer still had seen the shape of magic before it solidified into the laws we know. He was, quite literally, a relic of a different time. Still, isolation has a way of turning even the brightest minds inward until they become mazes of their own making. Without others to challenge him, Evergreen's thoughts often looped in circles. His plans became more elaborate, his sense of urgency more heightened, until he saw threats everywhere. Not just from cosmic dangers, but from within the hearts of those who claimed to be allies. Trust became a currency he refused to spend. This mindset made him uniquely suited for certain challenges and devastatingly ill-suited for others. When great disasters loomed, Evergreen could plan without distraction, without emotional compromise. But when those same disasters required unity, persuasion, or even kindness, his solitary approach often sowed seeds of resentment and misunderstanding. To some, he seemed arrogant. To others, almost tragic, a man who could see the danger coming, but could not convince the world to listen. One of the more fascinating traits Evergreen carried was his deep connection to the natural world, though not in the way most might imagine. He did not love nature in the soft, romantic sense. He didn't gaze at sunsets or marvel at flowers. Instead, his bond with nature was more akin to that of an engineer studying the clockwork of a massive, ancient machine. He understood how the wind moved not just as a breeze, but as a system of pressure, heat, and invisible pathways. He observed the growth of trees not for beauty, but for their resilience, how roots would crack stone, how bark would resist frost. It was through this lens that Evergreen approached magic. To him, magic was not a mysterious force to be worshipped, but an extension of natural law, one that could be learned, manipulated, and bent to purpose if only you had the will. And he had will in abundance. Some of his spells were modeled after storms, others after the precision of crystalline growth. In his mind, he was not breaking the rules of the world, merely writing new ones. His solitary studies often took him to places few dared to tread, jagged mountain peaks where the air was thin and sharp as glass, volcanic craters still hissing with molten life, and caves so deep they seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the planet itself. Here Evergreen felt most at home, away from the noise of lesser minds, surrounded by forces older than kings or kingdoms. He could think clearly. He could see the bigger picture. Yet even in these wild, lonely places, Evergreen was haunted by an awareness of time. He knew that every mountain eventually crumbles, every star eventually cools. Magic, too, was subject to change and perhaps even death. This realization fueled much of his urgency. In his mind, the preservation of magic was not just about personal power. It was about ensuring that the very lifeblood of the world would endure beyond his own lifetime. And this is where his lone path becomes something of a paradox. Evergreen was utterly devoted to a cause larger than himself, yet refused to share the burden of that cause with others. The thought of teaching someone else his methods filled him with unease. What if they used it wrong? What if they betrayed him? And perhaps, most damning of all, what if they surpassed him? For Evergreen, to be outmatched was unthinkable. As a result, his legacy, at least in this chapter of his story, was one of guarded brilliance. He had knowledge and insight that could have shaped generations of magic users, yet kept it locked away. It was not until much later, under extraordinary circumstances, that he would even consider passing it on. But by then time, as it so often does, had already begun to run out. If Evergreen was the mind and will behind the great comet-defending plan, then Gunther, his small, waddling apprentice, was the heart. Or at least, that's what we want to believe. But the truth is far more tangled, like the vines that creep up the crumbling spires of an old tower. Gunther's loyalty was real, yes, but it was also shaped by misunderstanding, fear, and a longing to please a master who, for all his brilliance, never quite understood how to nurture it. When we meet Gunther, we see a penguin, or at least something that looks like one, shuffling about Evergreen's lair. His role is humble, almost comedic. He's the one fetching tools, carrying notes, and nervously flapping as the great wizard bellows orders. It would be easy to dismiss him as comic relief, a sidekick whose only real purpose is to move the plot along. But if you watch closely, you notice something else. Gunther listens. He watches Evergreen with wide, almost childlike eyes, and beneath that quiet exterior is someone who desperately wants to be useful. In this way, Gunther is a mirror to Evergreen himself. Just as Evergreen's life is dominated by his need to prove his worth by stopping the comet, Gunther's is dominated by his need to prove his worth to Evergreen. The master wants to save the world. The apprentice wants to save the master's opinion of him. And both, in their own way, are trapped by those desires. We have to remember, too, that Gunther isn't just some random bird plucked from the ice. He's there because Evergreen chose him. That choice says a lot about Evergreen's view of the world. Perhaps he didn't want an equal, someone to challenge him, but instead a loyal assistant who would obey without hesitation. In that sense, Gunther is almost an extension of Evergreen's own will. He's not meant to be a partner in the traditional sense. He's meant to be the hands that carry out Evergreen's designs. But loyalty like that can become dangerous, especially when it's born of misunderstanding. And here's the heartbreaking truth. Gunther doesn't really know what the crown is or what wielding it might mean. Evergreen gives him pieces of the puzzle. It's powerful, it can stop the comet, it must be used correctly, but never the full picture. That means that when the moment comes, Gunther is not acting from knowledge, but from instinct. And instinct, in this case, will change the course of history. Still, it's worth pausing to appreciate the quiet moments between them. In the rush of the episode, we see little gestures, Gunther following Evergreen like a shadow, braving dangers simply because Evergreen told him to, clutching the crown as if it were the most important treasure in the world. These moments aren't just background detail. They reveal the way loyalty can grow not from perfect understanding, but from trust. And trust, once given, can lead someone to walk into fire without thinking twice. But trust isn't the same as clarity. Evergreen may have thought he was preparing Gunther to aid in his mission, but he was really preparing him to act in a way Evergreen would never expect. This is the paradox of their relationship. Gunther's faith in Evergreen becomes the very thing that undoes Evergreen's plan. It's the seed of tragedy planted right at the beginning, when the two first began their work together. Looking back, we can almost feel the inevitability of it. The grand wizard and his humble apprentice, one too focused on the comet to notice the growing weight of his own expectations, the other too devoted to question them. The closer the comet draws, the tighter this bond becomes, and the more it feels like the story is pulling us toward a moment neither of them can avoid. It's tempting to paint Gunther's role as that of a bumbling sidekick, a comedic foil to Evergreen's solemn intensity. But the reality is far more complicated. Gunther wasn't just a random penguin plucked from the ice. He was a creature who carried his own sense of pride, curiosity, and a strange sort of loyalty that didn't always align with Evergreen's grand vision. This loyalty wasn't the obedient kind Evergreen wanted. It was messy, emotional, and sometimes naive. Evergreen often treated Gunther as an instrument, a means to accomplish steps toward the crown's creation. In Evergreen's mind, there was no time for long conversations, gentle instructions, or patient mentoring. The comet was coming, and the fate of the world depended on speed and precision. But Gunther, for all his earnest attempts to help, wasn't built for this kind of harsh, single-minded environment. He needed understanding and encouragement. Two things Evergreen either didn't know how to give or didn't believe were worth giving. That mismatch led to one of the core misunderstandings of their partnership. Evergreen assumed that loyalty meant doing exactly as he said without question. Gunther, meanwhile, thought loyalty meant sticking by Evergreen no matter what, even if that meant bending or ignoring his orders when they didn't feel right. And when you're dealing with magic capable of rewriting reality, that kind of misinterpretation can have catastrophic results. One of the clearest examples of this comes when Evergreen sends Gunther on errands that seem trivial to the task at hand. In Evergreen's logic, these small assignments are necessary stepping stones toward completing the crown. But Gunther doesn't always see the bigger picture. He sometimes questions the urgency, or worse, improvises his own approach to make things better. His heart might have been in the right place, but in the realm of high-stakes magic, good intentions can be just as dangerous as malice. We can almost imagine the daily rhythm between them, Evergreen hunched over his workbench, muttering incantations, etching runes, refining the crown's structure. Gunther, meanwhile, dutifully or sometimes distractedly, gathering items, running messages, and occasionally staring at the crown with a mix of awe and unease. There's an unspoken tension in these moments. Gunther clearly cares about Evergreen, perhaps even admires him, but he also senses the isolation and arrogance that hang over the wizard like a storm cloud. The irony is that, in some strange way, Gunther wanted Evergreen's approval. He wanted to be more than just a helper. He wanted to be a partner, maybe even a friend. But Evergreen's personality didn't allow for equality in relationships. He saw himself as the sole architect of salvation, and Gunther as a necessary but replaceable part. This imbalance meant Gunther's efforts were rarely praised, and his mistakes were always magnified. And mistakes did happen. There are small hints in the flashbacks that Gunther's missteps, forgetting an ingredient, returning late, asking too many questions, irritated Evergreen more than they should have. The wizard's temper flared easily when his plans were delayed, and each scolding only widened the emotional gap between them. Over time, Gunther may have started to see Evergreen's mission not as a shared journey, but as a burden he had to endure for the sake of loyalty. Still, there's a quiet resilience in Gunther that's easy to miss. He could have walked away. He could have left Evergreen to face the comet alone. But he didn't. Whether it was out of duty, stubbornness, or an unspoken bond, he stayed. And in staying, he set the stage for the tragic turning point in their story, the moment when a simple misunderstanding, layered on years of mismatched expectations, would change the fate of the crown forever. Gunther's loyalty to Evergreen is, at first glance, admirable, almost heartwarming. But beneath that devotion lies a dangerous truth. Gunther doesn't really understand the purpose of the comet ritual, nor does he share Evergreen's obsession with controlling the forces of the universe. His loyalty isn't to the mission, it's to the man. This distinction matters because it means Gunther is motivated by emotion rather than ideology. Evergreen sees the comet as a challenge to his power, a threat to be conquered. Gunther sees it as an obstacle in his mentor's path, something to be removed purely so Evergreen will be happy. This dynamic creates a quiet tension between them, though Evergreen rarely notices. In Evergreen's mind, Gunther is merely a servant carrying out orders, not a partner with his own thoughts and motivations. And yet every so often, we see hints of Gunther's inner world, his frustration at being underestimated, his attempts to communicate his perspective, and his longing for acknowledgement. One of the most telling moments occurs when Evergreen explains the plan for the crown. His tone is sharp, dismissive, as though he's speaking to a child. Gunther nods along, eager to prove himself, but there's a flicker of doubt in his eyes. It's as if he's thinking, do we really have to do this? Is there no other way? But he never voices these questions. Perhaps he fears that speaking out would make Evergreen angry, or worse, disappointed. This silence becomes Gunther's defining trait. He absorbs Evergreen's commands without protest, bottling up his concerns until they become invisible. And in doing so, he enables Evergreen's increasingly reckless ambition. It's here that we start to see how loyalty, when untempered by understanding, can lead to disaster. Gunther is not stupid. He's perfectly capable of recognizing risk, but his attachment to Evergreen blinds him to the bigger picture. To him, the comet isn't a cosmic entity with its own role in the balance of the universe. It's just a problem his master says needs fixing. This is where their personalities diverge most starkly. Evergreen is a visionary, though a dangerously self-centered one. Gunther is a pragmatist, focused on immediate tasks and physical actions. Evergreen dreams in grand arcs, seeing himself as the hero who will save the world from a fiery doom. Gunther dreams in smaller, quieter ways of loyalty, of safety, of keeping the one person he serves alive. Ironically, this difference in outlook makes them a formidable team, at least in theory. Evergreen conceives the plan. Gunther executes it. One has the raw magical talent. The other handles the practical labor. But because Evergreen refuses to treat Gunther as an equal, the partnership is fundamentally flawed. There's no room for honest discussion, no space for Gunther to point out flaws or question decisions. And so, as they prepare for the ritual, Gunther's role becomes that of a silent witness helping, obeying, and hoping against hope that everything will go according to plan. In his mind, failure isn't an option, not because of the comet's threat, but because failure would mean letting Evergreen down. That's the tragedy at the heart of their relationship. Gunther's devotion isn't born of shared purpose, but of personal attachment. And that attachment, as we'll see, will be the very thing that changes the course of history. By the time the comet finally approaches, their working dynamic is set in stone. Evergreen is the commanding presence, his voice sharp with urgency, his eyes alight with determination. Gunther is the quiet shadow at his side, carrying the crown, fetching supplies, and glancing nervously at the sky. Evergreen believes he is steering the ship. In truth, both of them are adrift, Evergreen in his arrogance, Gunther in his blind loyalty, and neither realizes how close they are to losing everything. Gunther's loyalty, in truth, was a paradox. He was unwavering in his dedication to Evergreen, but that dedication was not born out of respect for Evergreen's vision or admiration for his personality. It was born out of something older, simpler, and perhaps purer, an ingrained sense of belonging to someone. Gunther's life was defined by this connection, though he may have wished for it to be more mutual, more nurturing. He followed Evergreen into storms, across wastelands, and into situations where even the stars themselves seemed to shrink away, not because he truly understood the purpose, but because Evergreen was his wizard. This raises a question that echoes through the ages: how much of loyalty is choice and how much of it is simply the comfort of familiarity? For Gunther, there was no weighing of options, no considering of alternatives. Evergreen was the anchor in his world, the only constant in a life that often felt like it could dissolve into chaos at any moment. But an anchor, while steady, can also keep you tethered in one place, unable to move freely. And Evergreen, though brilliant, did not make things easy for his apprentice. He could be impatient, demanding, and cold. Gunther's mistakes, inevitable for anyone in training, were met not with gentle correction, but with sharp reprimands. The young apprentice might have hoped for a teacher who celebrated small victories, who noticed the progress between the failures. But Evergreen's mind was always 3 steps ahead, already on to the next challenge before Gunther could catch up. The gap between them never closed, and perhaps it never could. And yet there were rare, fleeting moments that hinted at something softer. On particularly long journeys, when the wind howled like a beast through the mountains and the night threatened to swallow them whole, Evergreen would sometimes speak not of spells or battles, but of the way the world used to be. He'd tell of forests so dense with green that sunlight could barely touch the ground, of rivers so pure they reflected the sky without a ripple. His voice in those moments lost its edge, becoming almost wistful. And Gunther would listen, committing every word to memory, even if he didn't fully understand why it mattered. Perhaps those were the closest things to kindness Evergreen ever gave him. Still, misunderstandings clung to their partnership like a shadow. Gunther often mistook Evergreen's urgency for personal disappointment, believing that his master saw him as a burden. Evergreen, on the other hand, likely assumed Gunther understood the stakes of their mission, that the comet was not just a danger to them, but to the entire world. He never slowed down to explain, never ensured that his apprentice grasped the why behind the what. The result was a kind of tragic misalignment, one man thinking his apprentice lacked competence, the other thinking his master lacked care. It's tempting to view this as a simple story of a neglectful teacher and a struggling pupil, but that would ignore the layers beneath. Evergreen was not heartless, he was consumed by fear. The comet represented annihilation, and in the face of that, he couldn't afford to nurture Gunther's feelings. Gunther, meanwhile, was not incapable, he simply needed guidance that Evergreen didn't know how to give. In a different time, under different circumstances, perhaps they could have forged a stronger bond, but fate rarely offers second drafts. Their dynamic, as imperfect as it was, is one of the most fascinating relationships in all of Adventure Time's history. It's a reminder that loyalty can exist even without warmth, and that misunderstanding can thrive even in the closest partnerships. It also sets the stage for one of the most pivotal and heartbreaking turns in their shared story, a turn that would not only alter Gunther's life forever, but would ripple through time in ways neither of them could imagine. And as we move toward that moment, we see that Gunther's loyalty, his misunderstandings, and his quiet hope for recognition will collide in a single choice, a choice that will shape the destiny of not only himself and Evergreen, but the countless lives touched by the aftermath of their final mission together. The night sky over Ooo has always felt alive, its stars twinkling like distant storytellers, each one holding a chapter of some ancient tale. But there is one story written in the heavens that the people of Ooo cannot simply watch and forget. It is the tale of the comet, a celestial traveler whose arrival marks the turning of fate, the shifting of destinies, and the testing of the proud. This is not just any comet. It is older than the kingdoms of Ooo, older than magic as mortals know it. In its glowing heart burns something more than ice and dust. It carries purpose. Every 1,000 years or so, it streaks across the sky like a silver flame, visiting the worlds it has marked for change, and when it comes, it brings a choice and a challenge. For the Ice King, then still Hunson's curious, chaotic acquaintance, still a mix of a lonely wizard and the shattered remains of Simon Petrikov, the comet's approach was not something he truly understood. He did not read the signs in the stars, nor feel the ripple in the air that sensitive souls did. His mind was a storm of mismatched thoughts, always flitting between delusions of grandeur and childlike fantasies. Yet somewhere deep inside, the ancient magic of the crown seemed to stir as the comet drew near, as if the two were threads in the same tapestry. You see, in the lore of Ooo, the comet is said to arrive when a person, or sometimes an entire world, has reached a turning point. It may bring opportunity, it may bring ruin, but it always magnifies the truth of those it touches. For someone who has built his identity on fragile pride and misunderstood loyalty, the comet can be a mirror too bright to bear. In the months before its arrival, the Ice King's moods grew stranger. He became more determined to prove himself to others, to show that he was not just a silly old man in a bathrobe chasing princesses. He told Gunther half seriously and half in jest that they would welcome the comet like kings, perhaps even harness its magic. He imagined standing before its blazing light, the crown upon his head, and the world finally seeing him as a true ruler. But pride, as it often does, has a way of distorting truth. The Ice King thought of the comet as a gift waiting for him alone, a cosmic acknowledgement of his worth. He did not see it as the trial it truly was, and like many who mistake the star's intentions, he began to prepare for the wrong kind of meeting. He tried to craft grand spells from half-remembered scrolls, weaving together magic that was more dangerous than he realized. He demanded Gunther fetch rare ingredients, phoenix feathers, ice lily petals, even a drop of rainbow dragon's tear. These he piled in his icy halls, convinced that when the comet came, they would act as a beacon, drawing its magic to him like moth to flame. Gunther, ever loyal, obeyed without question. But the penguins' quiet waddles around the ice palace carried more than obedience, they carried worry. Though Gunther could not speak in words, something in his sharp little eyes seemed to know that the comet's power was not a plaything, and that his master's hunger for validation could lead him to ruin. Meanwhile, across Ooo, others felt the comet's approach. Princess Bubblegum read fluctuations in cosmic radiation, tracing a spike in energy back to a bright, fast-moving object in the void. Peppermint Butler whispered about ancient prophecies, and the Flame King scoffed, but kept a wary eye on the horizon. To some, it was just an astronomical marvel. To those who knew better, it was a harbinger. And so, as the comet inched closer, a strange quiet seemed to settle over Ooo. The nights grew clearer, the stars sharper, and in the distance, a faint point of silver began to glimmer on the horizon, a light that would soon grow into a blazing trail. In the Ice Kingdom, the Ice King stood at his highest tower, watching it. His heart swelled with anticipation, and somewhere deep in the frozen chambers of his mind, a whisper rose not from him, but from the crown. It is coming. And for the Ice King, that meant one thing. His moment had arrived. The comet did not come unannounced. Across the skies of Ooo, omens began to appear, strange auroras in colors no one could name, stars seeming to shift places overnight, and an uneasy hum in the air that you could feel in your teeth. Wizards whispered of an ancient cycle, a celestial rhythm that returned once in countless ages, each time bringing with it a harbinger of profound change. Hunson Abadir scoffed at the rumors at first. In his mind, he was untouchable, feared in every corner of Ooo, master of his own unending domain. What force could possibly threaten him? But deep down, in the quiet spaces of the nightosphere, he began to notice something he couldn't ignore. The gates between realms were weakening. Magic flowed differently, unpredictably, like a river that had begun to change course. When the comet finally appeared in the sky, it was unlike anything the people of Ooo had imagined. It wasn't just a burning rock. It was alive with an otherworldly presence, shimmering with light and shadow at once. It didn't streak across the heavens, it glided, deliberate, as if it were aware of its destination. Some claimed the comet was a messenger of destiny, come to choose the next great champion of the world. Others believed it was an executioner, a cosmic reset, meant to erase whatever had grown to corrupt. To Hunson, it was neither. In his eyes, it was a challenge. If pride, sharp and blinding, became his downfall, instead of preparing for what the comet might mean for the balance of Ooo, Hunson sought to control it. He envisioned siphoning its power, bending it to his will, and perhaps even reshaping the laws of magic themselves. After all, hadn't he done the impossible before? Marceline, however, sensed danger. She saw something in her father's eyes that worried her, a hunger not just for power, but for dominance over something far greater than himself. She tried to reason with him, reminding him of the last time cosmic forces had come to Ooo, and how even the most powerful beings were swept aside like leaves in the wind. But Hunson wouldn't listen. He told her this was his moment, his proof to every doubter and rival that Hunson Abadir was the one name no power could touch. As the comet drew closer, the land itself reacted. Plants began to bloom with strange colors. Rivers changed course overnight. The sky shifted through unfamiliar constellations. It was as if reality were quietly rewriting itself in anticipation. Hunson's plan unfolded in secrecy. He built a great summoning circle in the deepest chamber of the nightosphere, weaving runes in languages long forgotten. He intended to tether the comet's essence before it could even reach Ooo, drawing it into his own realm where he could contain it. He thought this would make him the sole wielder of its vast, unknowable power. But in stories like these, pride is always the sharpest blade, and it often cuts the one who wields it. When the comet's light finally touched the highest spire of the nightosphere, it was like a wave of silence rolled through the air. For a moment, the stars blinked out, the winds died, and time itself seemed to hesitate. Hunson began his incantation, his voice booming through the chamber, calling the comet by names no mortal tongue had spoken in eons. The response was immediate, and not at all what he expected. The comet answered. Its voice was not a sound but a feeling, an overwhelming presence that filled the mind with images of birth, destruction, and rebirth. It was not a gift to be claimed, nor a weapon to be wielded. It was an agent of change, and it had come with its own will. Hunson's runes began to warp and twist, rejecting his control. The very walls of his chamber trembled as a flood of raw, chaotic energy tore through the summoning circle. The comet's arrival was not a sudden, surprising event. It had been moving toward Ooo for eons, its slow-burning journey written into the stars themselves. But to Orgolorg, the knowledge of its approach was like the sound of a distant drumbeat that grew louder with every passing year. He could feel it long before most beings even knew to look upward. And in his pride, oh, that towering pride that had always been his undoing, he saw the comet not as a challenge, but as a birthright. In his mind, it was his to claim, his to devour, his to bend into fuel for his own dominion. The Ice King persona, though often clouded and distracted, still held within it those buried instincts. And at certain moments, usually in dreams or in strange slips of speech, those instincts bubbled to the surface. Gunther, the ever-loyal penguin, noticed. He always noticed. Where others would see only a strange old man talking to himself or staring into the night sky, Gunther could sense the shift in tone, the slow curling of words into something darker, grander. He didn't understand the comet's meaning, not fully, but he understood this. Whatever it was, it mattered to his master. And if it mattered to his master, it mattered to him. Meanwhile, far from the Ice Kingdom, the comet's passage began to stir whispers in the minds of others. Princess Bubblegum monitored the heavens with her own scientific instruments. Magic users across Ooo felt strange pulses in the air, as though reality itself was shivering. Even the most grounded creatures like Jake felt a prickling in the back of their necks when they gazed too long at the stars. The comet was more than rock and ice. It was a vessel of destiny. The legend said that every 1,000 years, such a comet brought with it a great power, a catalyst for change that could reshape the world. For some, that meant hope. For others, it meant ruin. For Orgolorg, it meant opportunity. But therein lay the seed of his downfall. Pride made him believe the comet was already his, that its fate and his were intertwined by cosmic law. And pride, as always, blinds more than it inspires. In the days leading up to its arrival, the Ice King began behaving in ways that unsettled even his closest, though reluctant, friends. He was secretive, muttering strange incantations under his breath. He vanished from the kingdom for hours at a time, returning with frost clinging to his beard and eyes that seemed just a little too sharp, too knowing. Gunther followed when he could, waddling through the snow with quiet determination. He saw his master climb icy ridges and speak to the empty air as though bargaining with unseen forces. Sometimes Gunther thought he caught a glimpse of shapes in the sky, vast, shadowy forms watching from beyond the stars. And then there was the night. The one where the air grew still, the snow stopped falling, and the sky took on a strange violet hue. That was when the comet first appeared in full view, a shimmering, otherworldly flame cutting through the dark. The moment it appeared, Orgalorg's instincts roared awake, washing over the Ice King persona like a wave breaking against a fragile shore. His voice deepened, his posture straightened, and his eyes, those usually scattered, wandering eyes, locked on the comet with the hunger of a predator that had waited lifetimes for its prey. Gunther shivered. Not from the cold, he was used to that, but from the realization that his master was no longer entirely his master. That night, the Ice King, or rather Orgalorg, stood at the very edge of the Ice Kingdom's tallest spire. The wind tore at his robes. The snow bit at his skin, but he did not move. He simply stared upward, unmoving, for hours. Gunther sat by his side the entire time, a small, round sentinel against the growing tide of fate. The comet drew nearer, and with every passing moment the line between who the Ice King was and who Orgalorg had been grew thinner, more fragile. Pride told him that he was ready. Destiny told him that this was his moment. The truth was far more complicated and far more dangerous. Ice King's pride had reached a point where it was almost blinding. Not just in the literal sense, though. His glittering ice palaces reflected the sun with such intensity they could dazzle anyone who looked too long, but in the emotional sense. His ambitions were no longer about merely proving himself a powerful wizard. They were about shaping the world in his image, bending it toward the story he thought should be told. And then the sky began to change. It started subtly, faint streaks of light appearing long before dawn, glowing green and gold against the inky blackness. Most creatures of Ooo saw them and thought, how beautiful. But to Ice King it was a challenge, a herald of something greater than himself. Somewhere deep in his bones, the crown whispered to him that these were signs of a cosmic arrival. He didn't know yet about the comet, but the crown knew, and its influence made him restless. Night after night, the lights grew brighter, weaving intricate patterns like runes across the sky. Wizards gathered in secret meetings to interpret their meaning. Kingdoms prepared offerings and rituals, unsure if they were welcoming a savior, a destroyer, or both. The air itself felt charged, as if every breath carried static. Even Finn and Jake, still young in their adventuring days, couldn't ignore the strange energy thrumming through Ooo. When the first whispers of the comet reached Ice King's ears, he laughed. A great being of cosmic power descending to change the fate of the world. Perfect. He would greet it as the mightiest wizard alive, perhaps even claim it as his ally. In his mind, the comet would descend, see his icy empire, and recognize him as an equal, a fellow architect of destiny. But the truth was far less flattering. The comet was not arriving for him. It was arriving for the world itself, to reset the board and tilt the balance of life. Yet Ice King, inflated with self-importance, began making plans. He crafted new spells, sharpened his control over the crown's powers, and even wrote a speech, yes, a speech to deliver when the comet arrived. Gunther, of course, was by his side for all of this, shuffling awkwardly under the heavy burden of preparing for a destiny that wasn't theirs. On the eve of its arrival, the sky was awash in color. The comet blazed toward Ooo like a celestial jewel, dragging a tail of shimmering dust behind it. Every living creature watched, hearts pounding. For many it was awe, for others terror. For Ice King it was anticipation. He stood on the tallest spire of his ice palace, robes billowing in the comet's wind, crown gleaming with an almost unnatural light. He was ready to step into a story he believed was written for him. But as the comet's presence filled the sky, something else filled Ice King's mind, something old, buried deep within Simon Petrikov's fractured memory. A strange, distant familiarity. The sight of the comet pulled at him, tugging at the few untouched threads of his humanity. For just a heartbeat, he felt small, and that feeling scared him. The comet passed directly overhead, a massive, radiant body roaring through the heavens. In that instant, Ice King realized it had no interest in him at all. Its energy flowed into the land, touching lives far removed from his own. Heroes rose, villains plotted, but he was left standing on his icy perch, watching as the world changed without him. That was the wound his pride couldn't handle. In the days following the comet's arrival, Ice King lashed out in unpredictable ways. His schemes became more erratic, his magic more dangerous, as if he could claw his way back into the story from which he'd been excluded. In truth, he was wrestling with the quiet humiliation of irrelevance, the realization that the universe could shift without him being the center of it. And yet, the crown still whispered. The comet may have passed, it told him, but other forces would come. Greater than the comet, greater than Ooo. And if he played his part just right, he might still have a chance to stand among them. Of course, as history would show, that chance would not lead to glory. It would lead him further down the road toward loss, madness, and an icy prison of his own making. But for now, Ice King stood beneath the strange, charged skies of a post-comet Ooo, his pride battered yet unbroken, already dreaming of the next cosmic event, already preparing to make the same mistake again. The snow never truly stops in the Ice Kingdom. It's not a natural snowfall, not anymore. Each flake is touched by magic, drifting endlessly from clouds that seem to exist only above these frozen lands. Somewhere deep inside this kingdom, among the echoing halls of ice, waddles a figure most would overlook a simple penguin, barely reaching a human's knee. His name is Gunther, or at least, that's the name most would know. But Gunther is no ordinary penguin. Beneath those small, beady eyes and that comically round belly hides something far older, far darker, and far more desperate. The truth is, Gunther's real name is Orgolorg, the Breaker of Worlds, a cosmic entity from beyond the stars, exiled to Earth in a frail, flightless form. Yet even powerful beings can fall prey to longing, and what Gunther wanted more than anything wasn't the stars or conquest or dominion over planets. No, what he wanted was the crown. The Ice King's crown, the ancient artifact of freezing power. He had been near it for centuries, serving Simon under countless guises waiting. The crown was a dangerous thing for any mortal, but to Gunther it represented an answer. Not just to reclaim his true form, but perhaps to shape a reality where he wasn't cast down, where his cosmic might was restored in full. But the crown's magic was unpredictable, a blend of human tragedy and primal elemental chaos. Simon had once tried to understand its workings, but for Gunther, it was not understanding he craved, it was possession. His waddling steps often brought him close, pretending to fuss with Ice King's robes, pretending to clean or fetch fish. Always watching, always calculating. The Ice King, in his distracted and lonely way, never truly noticed. He saw Gunther as his naughty little boy, his companion. Sometimes he'd even hand him the crown, playfully a dangerous act, if only he'd known. And in those brief moments, when the weight of it touched his feathers, Gunther felt something stir inside him. Not the warmth of friendship, but the cold clarity of power. There were stories whispered among magical circles that if the wrong soul bound itself to the crown fully, it could twist both the wearer and the artifact into something neither had ever been before. The curse, as most called it, was less a single spell and more like a hungry force one that latched onto its host and rewrote their destiny. Gunther's obsession began to change him. He no longer cared for his small schemes, for fish theft or petty mischief. He began watching the Ice King more closely during his moments of vulnerability when he removed the crown to sleep, or when he was distracted in conversation. In those moments, Gunther's mind burned with temptation. But there was a problem. The crown didn't simply choose a new master without resistance. The magic inside it was loyal in its own warped way to Simon. Even if Simon's mind was fractured, even if the man he once was had long since vanished beneath the snow, the bond remained. For Gunther to truly claim it, he would need to break that bond entirely. And so began the whispers of a plan. Somewhere in the frozen recesses of the Ice Kingdom, Gunther started piecing together fragments of forbidden knowledge spells and sigils left behind by long-forgotten visitors, scraps of scrolls from the Enchiridian's lost pages, even rumors from passing wizards foolish enough to speak in his presence. Each night, while the Ice King dreamed his erratic, lonely dreams, Gunther would wander the halls, his flippers pressed against icy walls, tracing patterns, leaving behind runes too faint for mortal eyes to see. The castle began to change in subtle ways, corridors that looped on themselves, staircases that led to shadowed alcoves where whispers seemed to echo without a speaker. Gunther was reshaping the kingdom into a ritual chamber without anyone realizing it. Every tower, every frozen arch, every jagged spire all aligned for a single moment in time, a moment he would bide his centuries for, when the magic of the crown would be vulnerable and his will could overtake it. But there was danger in this path. Magic of this scale always demanded a price. And Gunther, for all his cosmic memory, was walking toward a curse that even he could not fully comprehend. But the most fascinating part of Gunther's growing obsession was how quiet it was. There were no grand proclamations, no loud speeches declaring his intent. Just small, deliberate acts. Little gestures that, on their own, might have seemed harmless, even adorable. A pebble rearranged on a desk, a crown polished just a little too intently, a moment where he lingered in the shadow of the Ice King's throne, staring not at Simon, but at the object atop his head. It was here that we see the difference between desire and need. At first, the crown was simply something powerful that Gunther had been near for most of his existence. But over time, it became the only thing. Like a single star burning in his night sky, it consumed his view until nothing else could compete. And when anyone gets to that point of fixation, there's always a breaking point on the horizon. We don't know exactly when the decision crystallized in Gunther's mind, but we can sense its shape in the small historical ripples we have. In moments where the Ice King would be sleeping, muttering dreamily to himself, Gunther's eyes would linger on the crown. In those rare occasions when Simon removed it to clean it, or in a rare lapse of need, Gunther would be there, watching, perhaps even rehearsing the act in his mind. And this is where the comet enters our story once again, not the same one that foretold great heroes and great dangers, but the lingering cosmic energy it left behind in Oo's air. This was a time when the boundary between the magical and the mundane was especially thin. And in such a time, desire alone could sometimes shape destiny. The crown was always meant to respond to a will strong enough, and Gunther's will had begun to burn hotter than the one who already wore it. His plan, if we can call it that, was not crafted with the meticulous care of a schemer. Gunther was still, in his own way, chaotic and instinct-driven. But what he lacked in strategy, he made up for in sheer determination. And determination, when paired with an object like the crown, is often more dangerous than any grand design. It is believed that the day finally came during a rare moment when Simon was weakened, perhaps, after a draining magical exertion. Perhaps from the growing toll of the crown itself. Either way, Gunther seized the moment. The records we have are fragmented, pieced together from magical echoes and hints in later stories. Some speak of a sudden flash of frost in the middle of the night, the kind that doesn't just chill the air but freezes the sound itself. Others tell of a shrill, wordless cry echoing through the Ice Kingdom's halls, followed by an unnatural silence. In that silence, Gunther took the crown. What happened next is one of the most curious and unsettling transformations in the history of Ooo. The crown, a relic of immense ancient magic, attuned to the will of its wearer should have resisted. After all, it was already bound to Simon. But here's the unsettling part. It didn't. In fact, some say it almost welcomed the change, as if in Gunther it found a more primal, more focused echo of the being it was originally designed for. And in an instant, Gunther was no longer just the small, waddling penguin we had known. His form expanded, warped, shifting into something alien and ancient, the entity we later come to know as Orgolorg. The transformation was not slow or ceremonial. It was violent, abrupt, and absolute. Gunther's mind, already fixated on power, was suddenly merged with something far older and darker. Simon the Ice King could only watch, half stumbling, half reeling, as the being before him towered and howled with a voice that didn't quite belong to this plane. This was no longer about the crown. This was about a cosmic predator finally remembering what it truly was. And yet Gunther's core self was still in there somewhere. The obsession hadn't gone away. If anything, it had deepened, twisted by Orgolorg's returning consciousness. What had been a longing for the crown became a hunger for dominion, for control over all who stood between him and what he wanted. The battle in the heart of Ooo was unlike anything the world had seen since the days of the Great Mushroom War, and perhaps even stranger. On one side, the strange, quacking determination of Gunther, armed with the most dangerous magical artifact in existence. On the other, the desperate defenders of Ooo, each wielding whatever power, skill, or sheer will they could muster. But here's the thing about Gunther. This wasn't some evil mastermind with a grand, elaborate plan. He wasn't Galb, plotting the dismantling of universes. He wasn't even the Lich, whose very being radiated doom. Gunther's goal was painfully simple: to become Ice King again. To feel that odd, comforting security of being the bumbling, singing, crown-wearing wizard he once knew. The tragedy was that, in his desperation, he couldn't see that forcing this transformation would hurt everyone else. As the magic from the crown surged, the ground itself began to crack. Giant ice spires erupted, freezing everything in their path, trees, houses, even a few unlucky gum people. The air turned so cold that the breath from every living creature hung thick and unmoving, like fragile glass. Marceline fought her way toward Gunther, shouting over the roaring winds, "Gunther, stop! This isn't you!" But the penguin only gave a guttural screech, clutching the crown tighter. He was too far gone now, lost in the spiraling echoes of its magic. Finn and Jake pressed forward, dodging falling chunks of ice, each one sharp enough to slice a tree in half. "We gotta get the crown off him!" Finn yelled, gripping a sword. But getting close was nearly impossible. The blizzard surrounding Gunther swirled with shards of magic and frost, a shield of pure desperation. And then the voice began. Not Gunther's voice, but something far older and colder. The same whisper that had once consumed Simon Petrikov. You are nothing without me. It hissed through the air, an unshakable reminder of the crown's dominance over those who dared to wear it. For a flickering moment, Gunther hesitated, as though the words hurt him. But instead of throwing the crown aside, he pressed it down on his head with a furious cry. That was when magic exploded outward in a wave so powerful, it knocked Finn, Jake, and Marceline off their feet. The world went white. Snow and ice swallowed the horizon, and for a heartbeat, all sound vanished. When the blizzard cleared just enough to see, Gunther was gone. In his place stood a figure, tall, robed, crowned. It was the Ice King, and yet not. The form was wrong. His posture was stiffer, his movements sharper. The voice that left his mouth was cold and inhuman, lacking the awkward sing-song tones of Simon's cursed years. This wasn't the Ice King, they knew. It was the crown itself given shape, a pure embodiment of the ancient curse, using Gunther as its chosen host. It laughed a deep, hollow sound that rolled through the frozen streets like thunder. At last, it said, no more weak hands, no more pity, only the cold eternal. Everyone in Ooo felt it then, the sealing of the curse, tighter and more absolute than ever before. Whatever slim hope had existed of breaking the crown's grip on its wielder seemed to vanish in that moment. But in the shadows, hidden from the others, Princess Bubblegum watched with narrowed eyes. She had seen the curse's magic before, studied it in secret during the long years when Simon wandered Ooo. She knew that the crown's magic could be disrupted, though the cost might be unbearable. And if she was right, then Gunther's possession might have just locked the curse into a far more dangerous state than Simon had ever endured. As the new Ice King turned his gaze to the survivors, the sky above grew dark with heavy, swirling clouds. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. And so the moment came, the one that would decide not only Gunther's fate, but the fate of every soul in Ooo. The crown, once resting on his stubby little head like an oversized ornament, was now a blazing beacon of ancient magic. Its jewels pulsed in jagged rhythm, as if sensing that this was the final turning point. The winds outside the Ice Kingdom howled with unnatural fury, pulling at the clouds, scattering snow into violent spirals. Inside, the air crackled. Gunther stood before the throne, wobbling slightly, but not from weakness, from the sheer weight of what was pressing down on him. He had tasted the power, embraced it, and now it clung to him like an unshakable frost. The voice, Orgalorg's true voice, was no longer a whisper in the back of his mind. It was loud, booming, drowning out every other thought. You are me, I am you, and we are infinite. It wasn't a promise. It was a statement of fact. Far below, the few who had dared to approach the Ice Kingdom's borders were being forced back by the storm. Finn and Jake could only watch from a safe ridge, shielding their faces against the icy wind. They had seen magic before, even dangerous magic. But this felt different. This felt ancient. Alive. Jake, Finn muttered. Something's wrong. This isn't just Gunther putting on the crown again. Jake's eyes narrowed. Yeah, this is like big trouble magic. World-ending magic. Back in the palace, Gunther waddled up the icy steps to the throne and sat down, curling his little flippers around the armrests. A shudder went through the structure, the very ice beneath him humming like a struck bell. The crown's center gem flared not the pale, gentle blue of Ice King's reign, but a deep, dangerous violet. Orgalorg's essence was spilling into the world. Gunther didn't fight it. In fact, he welcomed it. Because for all the chaos and destruction Orgalorg promised, there was something else Gunther had learned to crave. Control. No more waddling in the shadows. No more being dismissed as just a penguin. This power was his now, and yet deep down, buried under the layers of greed and ancient memory, a faint spark of fear still lingered. The last of Simon's warnings, the desperate, fractured voice of the man trapped beneath the crown's magic, still echoed in the air. "Gunther, please don't lose yourself." But Gunther had already decided. The ritual began almost on its own. Dark symbols carved into the ice centuries ago and hidden under layers of frost began to glow beneath the throne. The magic here had been building for a long time, and now, with Orgolog's spirit fully aligned with the crown's power, it erupted. In the far reaches of the sky, cosmic forces took notice. The comet, the same that had passed before, the one tied to the cycle of heroes and destruction, shifted ever so slightly in its path. It was still distant, but now it was watching. Gunther's eyes flared white, his tiny frame lifting from the throne as if pulled by invisible strings. The Ice Kingdom groaned under the pressure, cracks spreading through towers of frozen spires. Somewhere far away, magical creatures stirred, sensing the shift. The curse. Orgolog's curse was no longer just a lurking threat in the shadows. It was being bound, sealed, not away from the world, but into it, into Gunther himself. It was the kind of sealing that didn't protect anyone, not really. It was the kind that locked the danger into a single vessel, ensuring that if that vessel ever broke, the release would be catastrophic. The last pulse of magic hit like a shockwave. Finn and Jake were thrown back into the snow. The storm collapsed inward, a sudden eerie calm replacing the screaming winds. And in the middle of the Ice Kingdom's tallest spire, the light of the crown dimmed back to a pale blue. Gunther sat there, still, silent, his head tilted ever so slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. And then, with almost comical slowness, he let out a quiet wank. But it wasn't the sound of a happy little penguin. It was the sound of a promise. The curse was sealed, and one day it would open again. The story of the Ice Crown doesn't begin with Simon, or with Gunther, or even with the fragile kingdoms of Ooo. Its roots reach back thousands of years, so far back that the world we know was a very different place entirely. It's a time most in Ooo have never even heard of, a time when the air shimmered with raw magic, when titanic beasts walked the earth, and when one wizard in particular was so proud, so sure of his own vision, that he unknowingly set a curse into motion that would echo across all of history. That wizard's name was Evergreen. Evergreen was no gentle scholar of magic. He was a force of will. His body was tall and reptilian, scales shimmering like deep emerald, with eyes that burned with ambition. He lived in the prehistoric age of Ooo, an era when the forces of nature were untamed, when magic wasn't just something you learned from books, but something that poured from the earth, the sky, and the very bones of ancient creatures. Evergreen was one of the most powerful sorcerers of his age, and his confidence bordered on arrogance. He was not alone, however. By his side was his small, penguin-like assistant, also named Gunther. This Gunther wasn't the same one who would serve the Ice King thousands of years later, but the connection between them runs deeper than simple coincidence, because the very name Gunther would come to be carried forward like a whisper through time. Evergreen's Gunther was clumsy, meek, and often confused by his master's lofty demands. To Evergreen, he was more servant than friend, useful, but hardly respected. The event that would change everything began with a catastrophe unlike anything the world had ever seen. A massive, flaming asteroid hurtling toward the planet. A skyfire big enough to wipe out everything. Where others saw inevitable destruction, Evergreen saw an opportunity not just to save the world, but to prove his power once and for all. His plan was simple in concept, impossible in execution. Create a magical crown so powerful that it could grant a single wish strong enough to stop the asteroid. This crown would not be a mere enchanted trinket. It would be the crown, the same one we know today. Evergreen intended it to be an instrument of his will, his genius made manifest. But here is the flaw in Evergreen's brilliance. He believed no one but himself was worthy to use such a creation. So he imbued it with a fail-safe. The crown would respond only to the one who wore it, bending reality to fulfill their deepest wish. Unfortunately for Evergreen, fate had its own ideas. The forging of the crown was a long and dangerous process, weaving together ancient magical essences, arcane gemstones, and the icy breath of elemental beings. Evergreen poured his life force into the work, focusing on every detail until it gleamed with cold perfection. The moment it was complete, he intended to wear it and wish away the asteroid. But the universe, as it often does in Adventure Time, played a strange and cruel trick. In the chaos of the asteroid's approach, Evergreen was separated from his creation, and it ended up on the head of his timid assistant Gunther. Now here's the part that would ripple through history. The crown doesn't grant wishes based on spoken commands. It digs deep into the wearer's subconscious, finding the truest, most powerful desire buried within. Evergreen's wish had been to stop the asteroid. But Gunther's heart carried a very different dream. He wished, perhaps without even knowing it, to be like Evergreen, strong, respected, powerful. No longer the small, overlooked helper, but a great wizard in his own right. The crown listened, and it answered. In that moment, Gunther's body and mind began to twist. His thoughts filled with Evergreen's mannerisms, his ambitions, his voice. He cast the magic that stopped the asteroid, saving the world, but in doing so, he imprinted Evergreen's personality into the very magic of the crown. From that day forward, the crown was cursed, forever seeking to mold its wearer into Evergreen's image, regardless of who they truly were. Evergreen himself perished in the asteroid's aftermath, never reclaiming the crown. Gunther's fate is uncertain. Some say he was consumed entirely by the crown's power, others that he simply vanished, his soul echoing faintly inside the enchantment. But what's certain is that this personality seed of Evergreen would echo forward through millennia, waiting for the next soul unlucky enough to don the icy headpiece. And eventually that soul would be Simon Petrikov. If Evergreen's crown was a single thread, then the centuries that followed wove an entire tapestry around it, sometimes bright, sometimes shadowed, but always defined by the curse that pulsed at its core. Even as the world changed beyond recognition, oceans shifting, mountains rising, civilizations crumbling, the crown remained untouched by time's decay. And in that unbroken endurance lay the most haunting truth. The will of its first creator was not a faint echo, it was a voice that refused to fade. In the ages immediately after the cataclysm that had swallowed Evergreen's era, stories of the crown transformed into something between a warning and a temptation. Tribes whispered of the White Death that could freeze a city in minutes, or the sky jewel that gave its wearer power over the elements. Yet the heart of those stories, the knowledge that the crown chose its master, was almost always lost. Sometimes the crown would pass decades, even centuries, resting in the ruins of some fallen city, buried beneath ice or ash. But eventually it always found its way back into mortal hands. Perhaps it was chance, or perhaps it was destiny, bending toward the will of that ancient, unfinished wish, to save the world, no matter the cost. There were kings who wore it to protect their people, only to find themselves guarding icy graveyards. There were wanderers who stumbled upon it in lonely caves and became legends for a time before their names froze alongside their bodies. The crown's magic never aged, never dimmed. What did change was the mind within it. Evergreen's thoughts, desires, and fears imperfectly imprinted in the crown became more fragmented, more tangled with each new host. His desperate, final command, meant to preserve life, began to warp into something less selfless, more possessive. One such host, long before Simon, was a warrior queen of the northern wastes. She wore the crown not as a protector, but as a weapon, carving her kingdom into the ice like a jewel in frost. She was feared, yes, but adored as well. And in her reign, the crown learned something new, to bind its wearer not just through compulsion, but through glory. Her victories fed the ancient echo of Evergreen's pride, weaving it deeper into the curse. And yet every ruler, every wanderer, every soul who claimed the crown met the same fate. The ice consumed them, not just their flesh, but their will, their identity. The curse was patient. It didn't need to destroy its host overnight. Like frost spreading over glass, it worked slowly, beautifully, inevitably. When the Mushroom War finally came centuries later, the world shifted once again. The war's violence tore through the planet's crust, unleashed magic and chaos in ways not seen since Evergreen's time. And somewhere amid the falling bombs and collapsing cities, the crown changed hands again. This time, it fell into the possession of a man who had no kingdom, no army, and no desire for power. Simon Petrikov was an antiquarian, a lover of history and the arcane, fascinated by relics of the old world. When he first touched the crown, the cold bite in his mind felt like discovery, not danger. But the curse was already awake, already whispering, already threading his thoughts with its own. Simon's tragedy was unlike the others. Where past wearers had been leaders, warriors, and rulers, Simon was a man defined by love, by the need to protect someone dear. This difference mattered because it meant the crown found a deeper root to cling to. Evergreen's original wish, to protect at all costs, resonated perfectly with Simon's heart. The curse didn't have to fight him, it only had to guide him a little further each time he wore it. And so, through Simon, the echo of Evergreen grew stronger than it had been millennia. The crown didn't just have a host, it had a purpose again. And with that purpose came the slow, inevitable transformation into the Ice King. And yet, even with all the centuries between them, there's this strange sense that Evergreen and Simon Petrikov are somehow speaking to each other across time. Not literally, of course, there's no cosmic walkie-talkie between the two, but rather, through the crown's enchantment, their emotions, fears, and flaws ripple forward and backward in history like waves hitting opposite shores. Evergreen's stubborn pride and refusal to accept help, Simon knew that feeling too well. Time and again, he rejected offers from Betty or others to help carry his burden, convinced that if he just held on a little longer, he could fix everything himself. Evergreen's disdain for lesser minds mirrored Simon's tendency to keep secrets, thinking he was sparing others from pain when in reality, those secrets often created more suffering. But there's another, darker echo. Evergreen was willing to reshape the world to protect it, even if it meant bending its laws. Simon, under the crown's influence, sometimes believed that the Ice King's bizarre schemes were for the greater good, whether that meant forcing people to stay with him, locking them in his castle, or saving princesses from what he imagined were threats. The warped logic was the same. If the power is yours, then the right to decide must also be yours. This is where the crown's curse shows its most haunting power, not in ice, not in magic, but in the way it rewrites the heart's justifications. Evergreen thought he was the only one wise enough to stop the comet. Simon thought he was the only one who could protect Ooo from, well, whatever he believed at the time. In both cases, the line between hero and villain was blurred until even they couldn't see it. And then there's Gunther, poor, eccentric, waddling Gunther who would, in the Ice King's reign, become something far more dangerous. If Evergreen planted the seed of the curse and Simon carried its heavy trunk, then Gunther was the twisted fruit that eventually fell from it. His desire to become the ultimate being wasn't born in a vacuum. He was shaped by centuries of observing Simon's instability, learning in his own warped way that chaos and ambition could lead to power. In a strange and tragic way, Gunther was both the crown's final victim and its ultimate heir. The echoes don't stop there. Even in the far-flung futures of Ooo, the crown's influence can still be felt in the whispers of ice magic, the appearance of frozen ruins, and the occasional discovery of fragments of the enchantment in places it shouldn't exist. It's as though the artifact refuses to fade, each new wielder unknowingly carrying forward the mistakes and desires of those who came before. What makes this story so chilling is that there's no neat resolution. The crown wasn't destroyed, the curse wasn't truly broken, yes. Simon was freed in a way, but the history, Evergreen's arrogance, Simon's desperation, Gunther's obsession, is still etched into the crown's magic, like a scar. It is a repeating pattern, a closed loop in the great fabric of time. Whoever wears it will, in some way, be living an echo of the first king's story. And perhaps that's the most tragic part. Evergreen wanted to save the world from destruction. Simon wanted to save the woman he loved. Gunther wanted to become something more. Different goals, different centuries, but all of them, without realizing it, were puppets dancing to the same icy tune. And so the Ice King Simon Petrikov lived out his days in a castle of frost, surrounded by treasures and trinkets of a mind long gone. Each snowflake that drifted down from his hands, each storm that howled across the Ice Kingdom, was a faint echo of Evergreen's ambition, though twisted now into something gentler, almost pitiful. The curse that had once been meant to save the world had, over countless centuries, transformed into a cycle of isolation and yearning. Evergreen had wanted to be remembered as a hero. Instead, his spirit lived on in a man who couldn't remember his own name at the time. But here's the strange part. Fate, it seems, doesn't care about our intentions. The same magic that had been born in a desperate moment during the prehistoric age found itself shaping the world again and again. When Simon donned the crown, he was unknowingly stepping into a story that had already been written eons ago. He was not just another wearer of the crown, he was the culmination of all its echoes, the living proof that Evergreen's choice still rippled through time. In Simon's life, we can see shadows of Gunther's fate, the loneliness, the small comforts found in companionship with strange creatures, the desperate clinging to the one thing that made life bearable no matter the cost. The crown, like a master storyteller, wove the same motifs into each of its chosen. Over and over again, its melody played, changing only slightly with each retelling, but always carrying the same haunting refrain. Yet, unlike Evergreen, Simon had people who cared for him even if he couldn't always remember them. Marceline with her quiet understanding, Finn and Jake, with their stubborn determination to see the good in him. These bonds didn't undo the curse, but they softened it. They kept Simon tethered to something human, something beyond the crown's cold whispers. It's almost ironic Evergreen had no such anchors. His world was fire and stone, a place where trust was dangerous and survival was everything. Simon's world, for all its magic and monsters, still held friendship, love, and the possibility of redemption. We might wonder if Evergreen had lived in Simon's time. Would he have resisted the crown's pull? Would he have listened if someone had told him there was another way? Or was the crown always destined to find those who could not let go of power once they tasted it? Time in Ooo is not a straight path. It loops and folds, dreams bleed into memories, and history hides in plain sight. Perhaps in some subtle way, Evergreen's memories guided Simon's hands when he shaped the ice, when he crafted his lonely kingdom. Perhaps Simon's dreams of strange, ancient lands were not just hallucinations, but faint echoes of a life long past. And perhaps, in the quiet moments between his rants and songs, Simon felt it a flicker of someone else's sorrow, someone who had walked this road before him. The tragedy and beauty of the crown's story is that it's not just one man's downfall, it's a shared legacy, passed through time like an unbroken chain. Each wearer adds a verse, each era changes the key, but the song itself remains. Evergreen's desperate wish became Simon's curse, and Simon's lonely heart became the Ice King's fragile soul. In this way, the crown is less an artifact and more a living story breathing, adapting, and waiting for its next chapter. And as the winds of Ooo carry snow across mountains and forests, the whispers of that story continue, carrying Evergreen's voice, Gunther's plea, and Simon's laughter all at once. It's a reminder that in adventure time, the past is never truly gone. It hides in the snow, it drifts in the dreams of the lonely, and it echoes in the choices of those who pick up a crown, believing they can bear its weight. And so, the echoes of Evergreen's cold resolve, Gunther's desperate wish, and Simon's tragic fate fade into the quiet stillness of Oo's snowy night. The crown's story is not just about magic or power, but about the choices, fears, and love that shaped it, and those who wore it. As we drift away from these tales, let the last image be of snow falling gently over the Ice Kingdom. Each flake carrying a whisper from the past, a reminder that every ending is simply another echo waiting to be heard. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Rest well, dream deep, and until next time, good night.